Alexander Martin's fingers trembled against the cool glass of his phone screen as he pretended to scroll through social media, but his eyes kept drifting upward to steal glances at the man sitting across from him in the crowded coffee shop. Thomas James was absorbed in his laptop, typing furiously with that focused intensity that made Alexander's stomach flutter with something he couldn't quite name. The afternoon light streaming through the window caught the golden highlights in Thomas's dark hair, and Alexander felt that familiar ache in his chest, the one that had been growing stronger for months now. He should look away. He knew he should. But there was something magnetic about the way Thomas's brow furrowed in concentration, the way his tongue darted out slightly when he was thinking hard about a problem. Alexander had memorized these little details over the past year of their friendship, cataloging them like precious treasures he could never admit to collecting. Thomas glanced up suddenly, catching Alexander in the act of staring. Their eyes met for a split second before Alexander quickly looked back down at his phone, heat flooding his cheeks. He heard Thomas chuckle softly, and the sound sent electricity shooting through his veins. "I think about kissing you," Thomas had whispered just 20 minutes ago, his voice barely audible over the coffee shop's ambient noise. "I think about it more than I should, more than makes sense." Those words had shattered something inside Alexander, something he'd been carefully holding together for so long, because he thought about kissing Thomas too. He thought about it when he woke up in the morning and when he fell asleep at night and during every quiet moment in between. He thought about what it would feel like to run his fingers through Thomas's hair, to trace the line of his jaw, to finally close the distance that had been torturing him for months. But how had they gotten here? How had two best friends ended up sitting in their usual coffee shop, the air between them crackling with unspoken possibilities and dangerous confessions? Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. To understand this moment, we have to go back 3 months earlier, to a rainy Tuesday evening when everything between them was still safe and undefined. Alexander had been sprawled across his couch, half watching a movie he'd seen a dozen times before, when his phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Can I come over? Just broke up with Jessica. Could use a friend." Alexander's heart had done that traitorous little skip it always did when Thomas reached out to him, even as he felt a stab of sympathy for his friend's pain. He'd typed back immediately, "Of course you can," and spent the next 20 minutes frantically tidying his apartment and trying to calm the nervous energy that always accompanied Thomas's visits. When Thomas arrived, he looked exactly like someone who'd just ended a 6-month relationship. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his eyes were red-rimmed, and he carried himself with the deflated posture of someone who'd been emotionally wrung out. Alexander had pulled him into a hug without thinking, the way he always did, but this time Thomas had clung to him a little longer, a little tighter. Alexander had felt the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the way his breathing wasn't quite steady, and something protective and tender had unfurled in his chest. They'd settled on the couch with beers and leftover pizza, and Thomas had started talking. Not about the breakup itself, but around it, in the careful way people do when they're trying to make sense of something that doesn't quite add up. "It just never felt right," Thomas had said, staring at the condensation on his beer bottle. "Like I was playing a part in someone else's story. Does that make sense?" Alexander had nodded, even though he wasn't sure it did. He'd watched Thomas date Jessica, had listened to him talk about her with what seemed like genuine affection, had even double-dated with them a few times. From the outside, they'd looked perfect together. Jessica was beautiful, successful, exactly the kind of woman Thomas usually went for. But sitting there in the dim light of Alexander's living room, watching Thomas struggle to articulate something he clearly didn't fully understand himself, Alexander began to see the cracks that had been there all along. "I kept waiting to feel something more," Thomas continued. "Some deeper connection, some sense that this was it, you know? But it was like I was going through the motions, like I was trying to convince myself I felt something I didn't actually feel." Alexander had wanted to ask what Thomas thought he should feel, what was missing, but the words had stuck in his throat. Because asking would mean admitting that he'd been watching, analyzing, cataloging every interaction between Thomas and Jessica with the obsessive attention of someone who cared far too much about the outcome. Instead, he'd done what he always did. He'd been the supportive friend, the good listener, the safe harbor where Thomas could work through his confusion without judgment. Maybe you just haven't found the right person yet, Alexander had offered, hating himself for the words even as he spoke them. Someone who makes you feel whatever it is you're looking for. Thomas had looked at him then with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. Something searching, almost vulnerable. What do you think that feels like? Thomas had asked. That connection everyone talks about? How do you know when you found it? The question had hit Alexander like a physical blow because he knew exactly what it felt like. He felt it every time Thomas walked into a room, every time their hands brushed accidentally, every time Thomas smiled at him like he was the only person in the world who mattered. But he couldn't say that. He couldn't risk everything they had for something that might only exist in his imagination. I think you just know, Alexander had said quietly. I think when it's real, when it's right, you don't have to convince yourself of anything. It just is. Thomas had been quiet for a long time after that, picking at the label on his beer bottle with the focused intensity he usually reserved for work problems. Alexander had watched him, memorizing the curve of his profile in the flickering light from the television, and wondered if Thomas could hear how fast his heart was beating. That had been the beginning, not of anything dramatic or sudden, but of a slow shift in the atmosphere between them. A new awareness that crept into their interactions like morning light, gradually illuminating a room. Over the following weeks, Thomas had started coming over more often, sometimes with a reason, sometimes without one. He'd show up with takeout, and they'd eat dinner together while watching whatever was on Netflix. He'd text Alexander during the work with random thoughts or funny observations. He'd call late at night when he couldn't sleep, and they'd talk about everything and nothing until one of them finally drifted off. Alexander had tried not to read too much into it. Thomas was dealing with a breakup, he was lonely, he needed the comfort of friendship. It was natural that he'd want to spend more time with the people who cared about him. Alexander told himself this over and over, but it became harder to believe as the weeks passed and Thomas showed no signs of pulling back or seeking comfort elsewhere. There were moments that felt different, charged with something Alexander was afraid to name, like the night Thomas had fallen asleep on his couch during a movie, and Alexander had covered him with a blanket, letting his fingers brush against Thomas's hair for just a second longer than necessary. Or the morning Thomas had stayed over and Alexander had found him making coffee in his kitchen, wearing one of Alexander's old college sweatshirts, looking so perfectly at home that Alexander's chest had tightened with longing. Can I ask you something? Thomas had said one evening about 6 weeks after the breakup. They'd been sitting on Alexander's balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Of course, Alexander had replied, though his stomach had clenched with nervous anticipation. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? Thomas had asked. Like you're following a script that doesn't quite fit? The question had been so close to Alexander's own experience that he'd almost choked on his wine. Because yes, he knew exactly what that felt like. He'd been living it for years, pretending to be satisfied with a friendship when what he really wanted was so much more. Sometimes, Alexander had admitted. Why do you ask? Thomas had been quiet for a moment, swirling the wine in his glass. I've been thinking about what you said, about knowing when you found the right connection, and I keep wondering if maybe I've been looking in the wrong places, or for the wrong things. Alexander's heart had started beating faster, but he'd kept his voice carefully neutral. What do you mean? Thomas had looked at him then, and there had been something different in his expression. Something that made Alexander's breath catch. I mean, maybe I've been so focused on what I thought I was supposed to want that I missed what was right in front of me. The words had hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Alexander had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from either flying or falling. Thomas, he had started, but Thomas had shaken his head. Sorry, Thomas had said quickly, that probably doesn't make much sense. I'm still figuring things out. But it had made sense. It had made perfect, terrifying sense. And Alexander had spent the rest of that night lying awake, replaying every word, every look, every moment of hesitation and possibility. The shift after that conversation had been subtle but unmistakable. Thomas started sitting closer to him on the couch, close enough that their thighs would touch and neither of them would move away. He'd find excuses to make physical contact, a hand on Alexander's shoulder when he laughed, fingers brushing when they reached for the same thing, hugs that lasted just a beat longer than they used to. Alexander had tried to convince himself he was imagining it, reading too much into innocent gestures born of grief and loneliness. But then there were the looks, moments when he'd catch Thomas watching him with an intensity that made his skin feel too tight, his pulse too fast. Moments when Thomas's gaze would drop to his lips for just a second before snapping back up, leaving Alexander wondering if it had really happened or if it was just wishful thinking. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago, on a Friday night when Thomas had shown up at Alexander's door without warning, looking shaken and confused. "I need to talk to someone," Thomas had said, and Alexander had let him in without question, the way he always did. They'd settled in their usual spots on the couch, but Thomas had seemed restless, unable to sit still. He'd gotten up to pace, then sat back down, then gotten up again. "What's going on?" Alexander had asked finally. "You're making me nervous." Thomas had stopped pacing and turned to face him, running a hand through his hair, in the gesture Alexander knew meant he was struggling with something difficult. "I had coffee with Jessica today," Thomas had said. "She wanted to talk about getting back together." Alexander's stomach had dropped, but he'd kept his expression carefully neutral. "How do you feel about that?" "That's just it," Thomas had said, starting to pace again. "I don't know how I feel about anything anymore. She was sitting there telling me how much she missed me, how good we were together, and all I could think about was how wrong it felt, how empty." He'd stopped pacing again and looked directly at Alexander, and then she asked me if there was someone else, and I said no, but the whole time I was thinking about you. The words had hit Alexander like a physical blow. He'd felt the world tilt on its axis, everything he thought he knew about their friendship suddenly shifting into new and dangerous territory. "Thomas?" he had whispered. Not sure if it was a warning or a plea. "I know how that sounds," Thomas had continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know it's crazy, but I can't stop thinking about you, about us, about what this is between us. And I'm tired of pretending I don't feel it." Alexander had felt like he couldn't breathe. This was everything he'd wanted and everything he'd been terrified of, all wrapped up in Thomas's earnest, confused expression. "What are you saying?" Alexander had managed to ask. "I'm saying I think I might not be as straight as I thought I was," Thomas had said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm saying that every relationship I've ever had has felt like I was trying to fit into someone else's idea of what I should want. And I'm saying that the only time I feel like myself, really myself, is when I'm with you." Alexander had stared at him, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might break the spell of this moment. "I think about kissing you," Thomas had continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I think about what it would feel like to hold you, to wake up next to you, to stop pretending that what I feel for you is just friendship." And that was how they'd ended up here, in their usual coffee shop, the weight of Thomas's confession hanging between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Alexander looked up from his phone to find Thomas watching him, no longer pretending to work on his laptop. The expression on Thomas's face was soft, vulnerable, hopeful, and it made Alexander's chest tight with emotion. "You've been quiet," Thomas said softly. "Since I told you how I feel, are you okay?" Alexander set his phone down on the small table between them, his hands trembling slightly. He'd spent 2 weeks thinking about Thomas's confession, 2 weeks trying to figure out how to respond without destroying everything they had. "I'm scared," Alexander admitted quietly. "Terrified, actually." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Alexander's face. "Of what?" "Of this," Alexander said, gesturing between them. "Of ruining what we have. Of wanting something so badly that I can't think straight." Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "What do you want, Alexander?" Thomas asked finally. "Not what you think you should want, not what's safe. What do you actually want?" The question hung in the air between them, and Alexander felt like he was standing at the edge of that cliff again, one step away from everything changing forever. "I want you," Alexander said finally, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of months of suppressed longing. "I've wanted you for so long, I can't remember what it felt like not to want you." Thomas's breath caught, and something shifted in his expression. Relief maybe, or recognition. "How long?" Thomas asked softly. Alexander let out a shaky laugh. "Honestly, probably since the day we met, but I didn't let myself admit it until recently. Until you started pulling away from Jessica, and I realized how much I'd been hoping you would." Thomas reached across the small table and covered Alexander's hand with his own. The touch sent electricity shooting up Alexander's arm, and he had to resist the urge to pull away from the intensity of it. "I'm sorry I put you through that," Thomas said. "All those months of listening to me talk about her, about relationships that weren't working, when what I was really looking for was sitting right in front of me." Alexander turned his hand palm up so their fingers could intertwine, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. "You couldn't have known," Alexander said. "I certainly wasn't going to tell you. I was too afraid of losing you." "And now?" Thomas asked, his thumb tracing small circles on Alexander's palm. "Now I'm still afraid," Alexander admitted. "But I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what could have been." Thomas smiled then, the first real smile Alexander had seen from him in weeks. "So what do we do?" Thomas asked. "How do we figure this out?" Alexander looked around the coffee shop, suddenly aware of how public they were, how exposed. Other patrons were absorbed in their own conversations and laptops, but he still felt like everyone could see the shift happening between them, the way the air seemed to shimmer with possibility. "Maybe we could start by getting out of here," Alexander suggested. "Go somewhere we can actually talk without feeling like we're on display." Thomas nodded immediately, already reaching for his laptop bag. "Your place or mine?" Thomas asked, then paused, seeming to realize the implications of the question. "Mine," Alexander said quickly. "It's closer." They gathered their things in relative silence, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people trying not to think too hard about what they were doing. Alexander's hand shook slightly as he packed up his phone and wallet, hyper-aware of Thomas moving beside him, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the way his cologne mixed with the coffee shop's ambient scents. The walk to Alexander's apartment took only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. They walked close together, their shoulders bumping occasionally, neither of them speaking. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged, full of anticipation and nervous energy. Alexander fumbled with his keys at the front door, his hands trembling with adrenaline. Thomas stood behind him, close enough that Alexander could feel his breath on the back of his neck, and it took 3 tries to get the key in the lock. Once inside, they stood in Alexander's living room, suddenly awkward with each other in a way they'd never been before. All their easy familiarity seemed to have evaporated, replaced by the weight of everything they'd just admitted. "Do you want something to drink?" Alexander asked, falling back on the safety of routine. "Actually," Thomas said, stepping closer, "I think I want to try something else first." Alexander's breath caught as Thomas reached up to cup his face, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones with devastating gentleness. "Is this okay?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander could only nod, not trusting his voice. Thomas's hands were warm against his skin, and he could see flecks of gold in Thomas's brown eyes that he'd never noticed before. "I've never done this before," Thomas said softly. "With a man, I mean. I don't really know what I'm doing." "Neither do I," Alexander admitted. "Not really, but I know I want to find out." Thomas smiled at that, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Can I kiss you?" Thomas asked, and the question sent a bolt of pure electricity through Alexander's entire body. "Please," Alexander whispered, and then Thomas was leaning in, closing the distance between them with agonizing slowness. Their lips met softly at first, a gentle brush that sent shockwaves through Alexander's entire nervous system. Thomas pulled back slightly as if testing the waters, and Alexander made a small sound of protest that seemed to break something loose in Thomas. The second kiss was deeper, more certain, and Alexander felt like he was drowning in the best possible way. Thomas's lips were soft and warm, and he tasted like coffee and something indefinably sweet. Alexander's hands found their way to Thomas's waist, pulling him closer, and Thomas made a soft sound against his mouth that nearly undid him completely. They kissed until they were both breathing hard, until Alexander's legs felt unsteady and his heart was pounding so hard he was sure Thomas could hear it. When they finally broke apart, they stayed close, foreheads touching, sharing the same air. "Wow," Thomas breathed, and Alexander could feel him smiling. "Yeah," Alexander agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Wow." They stood there for a moment, just breathing together, and Alexander felt something settle into place inside his chest. Something that had been restless and aching for months, finally going quiet and still. "That was," Thomas started, then shook his head with a laugh. I don't have words for what that was. Perfect, Alexander supplied. That was perfect. Thomas pulled back enough to look at him properly, his hands still framing Alexander's face. I can't believe I waited so long to do that, Thomas said. I can't believe I almost missed this. Alexander leaned into the touch, letting himself finally relax into the reality of this moment. We have time now, Alexander said. All the time in the world to figure this out. Thomas's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. I love the sound of that, Thomas said, then paused, his expression growing more serious. Alexander, I need you to know something. This isn't just curiosity for me, or some kind of experiment. What I feel for you, it's real. It's the most real thing I've ever felt. Alexander felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Thomas's voice. I know, Alexander said softly. I can see it in your eyes. And Thomas, what I feel for you, it's been real for so long, I forgot what it felt like to not be in love with you. Thomas's breath caught at the word love, and Alexander realized he had said it without meaning to. But looking at Thomas's face, seeing the wonder and joy spreading across his features, he couldn't bring himself to take it back. You love me? Thomas asked, his voice full of amazement. I love you, Alexander confirmed, the words feeling like coming home. I've loved you for months, maybe longer. I just never thought I'd get to tell you. Thomas kissed him again then, soft and sweet and full of promise. I love you too, Thomas whispered against his lips. I think I have for a while, I just didn't know what to call it. They moved to the couch, settling into each other with the easy intimacy of people who'd been dancing around this moment for months. Thomas curled into Alexander's side, his head on Alexander's shoulder, and Alexander wrapped his arms around him, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. So what happens now? Thomas asked, his voice soft and content. Now we figure it out as we go, Alexander said, pressing a kiss to the top of Thomas's head. One day at a time. Thomas tilted his head up to look at him. Are you worried? Thomas asked. About what people will think, about how this changes things? Alexander considered the question seriously. Was he worried about his family, his friends, the way the world might see them differently? Of course he was. But looking down at Thomas, seeing the trust and love in his eyes, those worries felt manageable. Secondary to the overwhelming rightness of this moment. I'm sure I'll have moments of panic, Alexander said honestly. But right now, all I can think about is how happy I am. How complete this feels. Thomas smiled and settled back against Alexander's chest. Good, Thomas said, because I've never felt anything like this before. Like I've been holding my breath my whole life and I can finally breathe. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just holding each other, letting the reality of their new situation sink in. Alexander traced lazy patterns on Thomas's arm, amazed that he was allowed to do this now. That touching Thomas wasn't something he had to steal in careful, hidden moments. Can I tell you something? Thomas said eventually. Anything. That night on your balcony when I was talking about feeling like I was living someone else's life, I almost kissed you then. I wanted to so badly I could barely sit still. Alexander's hand stilled on Thomas's arm. Really? Really? You were looking at me with this expression I couldn't quite read, and the moonlight was hitting your face just right. And I thought, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. But then I got scared and changed the subject. I remember that night, Alexander said softly. I went to bed wondering if I'd imagined the way you were looking at me. You didn't imagine it, Thomas said, tilting his head up to meet Alexander's eyes. I was probably being ridiculously obvious. I'm surprised you didn't call me out on it. I was too afraid I was seeing what I wanted to see instead of what was actually there. Thomas shifted so he could face Alexander more fully. What about now? Thomas asked. What do you see now? Alexander looked at him, taking in the soft expression, the way Thomas's hair was mussed from lying against his shoulder, the love shining clearly in his eyes. I see my future, Alexander said simply. I see the person I want to build a life with. Thomas's eyes filled with tears and he leaned up to kiss Alexander again, slow and thorough and full of promise. I can't believe this is real, Thomas whispered against his lips. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out I dreamed the whole thing. It's real, Alexander assured him, running his fingers through Thomas's hair. We're real. They spent the rest of the evening talking, sharing stories and confessions and plans for the future. Thomas told him about the moment he'd realized his feelings had shifted, about the panic and confusion and eventual acceptance. Alexander shared his own journey, the months of hidden longing and careful hope, the way every interaction with Thomas had felt like both a gift and a torture. As the night grew later, they migrated to Alexander's bedroom, not for anything physical beyond holding each other, but because neither of them wanted to let go. They lay facing each other in the dim light from the street lamp outside, talking in whispers like teenagers afraid of being overheard. "I should probably call Jessica," Thomas said eventually. "Let her know definitively that we won't be getting back together." "How do you think she'll take it?" Alexander asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think she suspected something, actually. When I told her I couldn't get back together with her, she asked if I was in love with someone else. And when I said I didn't know, she said she hoped I'd figure it out soon because I deserved to be happy. She sounds like a good person." "She is," which made it even harder, you know? "I kept thinking that if I was going to break up with someone, it should be because they were wrong for me in some obvious way. But Jessica wasn't wrong, she just wasn't right. She wasn't you." Alexander reached out to trace the line of Thomas's jaw, still amazed that he was allowed to touch him like this. "I'm sorry you had to go through all that confusion," Alexander said. "I wish there had been an easier way for you to figure this out." "Are you kidding?" Thomas said, catching Alexander's hand and pressing a kiss to his palm. "This is the best possible outcome. I get to be with the person I love, and I finally understand who I really am. I wouldn't change any of it." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, Alexander's face buried in Thomas's neck, breathing in the scent of his skin and marveling at the fact that this was his life now. He woke up several times during the night just to make sure it was real, that Thomas was really there in his bed, solid and warm in his. The next morning, Alexander woke to find Thomas already awake, watching him with a soft smile. "Good morning," Thomas said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," Alexander replied, leaning in to kiss him gently. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Thomas said. "You? Like a baby." Alexander stretched, then settled back into Thomas's arms. "So this is what it's like to wake up with you. Get used to it," Thomas said, tightening his hold. "Because I don't plan on spending many nights away from you from now on." They made breakfast together, moving around Alexander's small kitchen with surprising ease. Thomas had stayed over enough times that he knew where everything was, but there was something different about it now. The casual touches, the stolen kisses, the way Thomas would come up behind him while he was cooking eggs and wrap his arms around his waist. "This feels so natural," Thomas said, his chin resting on Alexander's shoulder. "Like we've been doing this for years." "In a way, we have been," Alexander pointed out. "We just weren't allowed to touch each other the way we wanted to." Thomas hummed in agreement, pressing a kiss to the side of Alexander's neck that made him shiver. "I have a confession," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about this for weeks, about what it would be like to wake up with you, to make breakfast together, to just be domestic and normal and in love." Alexander turned in Thomas's arms, spatula still in hand. "Just weeks?" Alexander asked with a grin. "I've been thinking about it for months." Thomas laughed and kissed him, tasting like coffee and possibility. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for," Thomas said against his lips. "We have the rest of our lives to make up for it," Alexander corrected, and felt Thomas smile against his mouth. Over the following days, they settled into their new reality with surprising ease. Thomas had been practically living at Alexander's apartment anyway, so the transition felt natural, inevitable. They told their close friends first, starting with Alexander's roommate Tyler Peterson, who took one look at them sitting together on the couch, Thomas's hand resting casually on Alexander's thigh, and said, "Finally, I was wondering how long you two were going to keep pretending you weren't crazy about each other." "Really?" Alexander asked, surprised. "It was that obvious?" Tyler had laughed. "Alexander, you've been looking at him like he hung the moon for as long as I've known you. And Thomas, you started finding excuses to come over here like 3 times a week after you broke up with Jessica. I'm not exactly a relationship expert, but even I could see which way the wind was blowing." Thomas's friends were equally unsurprised, though they were more curious about the logistics of his sexual awakening. James Ramos, Thomas's best friend since college, cornered them at a group dinner the following weekend. "So," James said, settling into the booth across from them with a beer, "I have to ask, How exactly does someone just figure out they're not straight at 28? Thomas had fielded the question with more grace than Alexander would have managed, explaining about the growing sense that something was missing from his relationships. The way being with Alexander felt different from anything he'd experienced before. It's not like I woke up one day and decided to be attracted to men, Thomas said. It was more like I finally stopped ignoring what I was already feeling. And you, James said, turning to Alexander, how long have you been carrying a torch for this guy? Long enough to have given up hope that anything would ever happen, Alexander admitted. I was pretty convinced I was going to spend the rest of my life being his best friend and secretly dying inside. Well, James said, raising his beer in a toast, here's to no longer dying inside. They clinked glasses, and Alexander felt another piece of his old life clicking into place with his new one. The hardest conversation was with Thomas's parents, who called a week later for their usual Sunday check-in. Thomas had been nervous about it for days, pacing around Alexander's apartment and practicing different ways to bring it up. Just tell them you're happy, Alexander had suggested. Tell them you found someone who makes you feel like yourself. But what if they ask questions I'm not ready to answer? Thomas had worried. What if they want to know how I know I'm not just confused or going through a phase? Then you tell them that you know because you know, Alexander had said simply. You don't owe anyone an explanation for who you love. In the end, the conversation had gone better than either of them had expected. Thomas's mother had been surprised but supportive, asking gentle questions about how long he'd known and whether he was happy. His father had been quieter, more processing than reactive, but he'd ended the call by saying he loved Thomas and wanted to meet Alexander soon. My mom wants to have dinner with us next weekend, Thomas had reported after hanging up. She said she wants to get to know the person who makes me light up when I talk about him. I make you light up? Alexander had asked, grinning. Like a Christmas tree, Thomas had confirmed, pulling him into a kiss. Alexander's own parents had been similarly accepting, his mother immediately launching into planning mode about when they could visit and whether Thomas would be coming to family events. His father, a man of few words, had simply said, "If he makes you happy, son, that's all that matters to us." As the weeks passed, they found their rhythm. Thomas officially moved in, though most of his stuff had already migrated to Alexander's apartment over the months of their friendship. They divided up household responsibilities, discovered each other's annoying habits, had their first real fight about whose turn it was to do the dishes, and made up with the kind of passionate intensity that left them both breathless and laughing. The physical side of their relationship developed slowly, carefully. Thomas was navigating new territory, and Alexander was patient, letting Thomas set the pace. They spent hours just kissing, exploring the feel of each other's hands and mouths, learning what made the other gasp or moan or arch into touch. I never understood what people meant when they talked about chemistry, Thomas said one evening as they lay tangled together on the couch, both of them shirtless and breathing hard from a particularly intense makeout session. But this feeling like I might spontaneously combust if you stop touching me? I get it now. Alexander had laughed, pressing a kiss to Thomas's collarbone. Just wait, Alexander had murmured against his skin. We're just getting started. 3 months later, they were back in their original coffee shop, the same table where Thomas had first confessed his feelings. But everything was different now. Thomas sat next to Alexander instead of across from him, their fingers intertwined on the table, no longer hiding or pretending. Remember when you used to sit over there and pretend to look at your phone while you stared at me? Thomas asked, grinning. Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. You knew? Alexander asked, mortified. Of course I knew, Thomas said, bringing their joined hands up to press a kiss to Alexander's knuckles. You're not nearly as subtle as you think you are, though to be fair, I was doing the same thing. I just got better at hiding it. So we were both sitting here pining for each other like idiots? Pretty much, Thomas confirmed, which now that I think about it, is actually kind of romantic, in a completely ridiculous way. Alexander shook his head, laughing. We could have saved ourselves months of agony if one of us had just been brave enough to say something. But would it have been the same? Thomas asked, suddenly serious. If it had happened earlier, before I was ready to understand what I was feeling? Alexander considered this, thinking back to the confused, conflicted person Thomas had been during his relationship with Jessica. Probably not, Alexander admitted. You needed time to figure yourself out, and I needed time to work up the courage to risk our friendship. Then it happened exactly when it was supposed to, Thomas said, squeezing his hand. And look where we ended up. Alexander looked around the coffee shop, taking in the familiar sights and sounds, then back at Thomas's face, open and happy, and so clearly in love that it took his breath away. Where did we end up? Alexander asked, though he knew the answer. Home, Thomas said simply. We ended up home. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world go by through the window. Other couples came and went, friends met for coffee, students hunched over laptops working on assignments. Normal life continuing around them while they existed in their own bubble of contentment. I have something to tell you, Thomas said eventually, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. Alexander turned to face him fully, immediately alert to the change in Thomas's tone. What is it? I got a call from my boss yesterday, Thomas said, about that promotion I applied for months ago. Alexander felt his stomach drop. The promotion Thomas was talking about would mean a transfer to the company's San Francisco office, 3,000 miles away from everything they built together. And, Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. I turned it down, Thomas said, and Alexander felt the world shift back into focus. You what? I turned it down, Thomas repeated, smiling at Alexander's shocked expression. I told them I had something more important here that I wasn't willing to give up. Thomas, that was your dream job, Alexander said, torn between relief and guilt. You've been working toward that promotion for years. It was my dream job when I thought career success was the most important thing in my life, Thomas said. But that was before I knew what it felt like to be truly happy, before I understood that home isn't a place, it's a person. Alexander felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Are you sure? Alexander asked. I don't want you to resent me later for holding you back. Thomas cupped Alexander's face in his free hand, thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. Alexander, listen to me, Thomas said firmly. You're not holding me back. You're the reason I finally understand what I want from life. Success doesn't mean anything if I don't have someone to share it with, and I want to share everything with you. Alexander leaned into the touch, overwhelmed by the depth of love in Thomas's voice. Besides, Thomas continued, grinning, they offered me a different position here. Senior developer, working remotely with the San Francisco team. Same pay, better work-life balance, and I get to stay with the person I love. It's perfect. You're perfect, Alexander said, then kissed him right there in the coffee shop, not caring who saw them. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling so hard their faces hurt. So what now? Alexander asked. What's next for us? Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Alexander could see him gathering his thoughts. Well, Thomas said slowly, I was thinking we could start by making this official. Official how? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, setting it on the table between them. Alexander's breath caught, his heart suddenly racing. Thomas, he whispered, staring at the box like it might explode. It's not what you think, Thomas said quickly, then paused. Well, it's not exactly what you think. It's a promise ring. A promise that someday when we're both ready, when the time is right, I want to marry you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Alexander looked up from the box to meet Thomas's eyes, which were shining with love and hope and just a touch of nervousness. You want to marry me? Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to marry you, Thomas confirmed. I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to fight about whose turn it is to take out the trash and make up by kissing you senseless. I want to grow old with you and complain about our creaky joints and still hold hands when we're walking down the street at 80. Alexander felt tears streaming down his face now, but he was smiling so hard his cheeks ached. Yes, Alexander said, then louder. Yes, of course, yes. Thomas opened the box to reveal a simple silver band, elegant and understated and perfect. It's beautiful, Alexander said as Thomas slipped it onto his ring finger. Not as beautiful as you, Thomas said, then laughed at his own cheesiness. Sorry, that was terrible. I'm nervous. Don't apologize, Alexander said, admiring the way the ring caught the light. I love terrible romantic declarations, especially when they come from you. Good, Thomas said, visibly relaxing, because I have about 1 million more stored up. They sat there grinning at each other like fools, both of them giddy with happiness and the magnitude of what they just committed to. I love you, Alexander said, the words feeling both familiar and brand new. I love you too, Thomas replied, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person. Alexander looked down at the ring on his finger, then back up at Thomas's face, and felt something settle deep in his chest. A sense of rightness, of completion, of finally being exactly where he was supposed to be. You know what the best part is? Alexander said. What? We get to figure out the rest together, Alexander said. All of it, the engagement, the wedding, the marriage, growing old together. We get to do it all together. Thomas reached across the table to take his hand, thumb brushing over the new ring. Together, Thomas agreed. I like the sound of that. As they sat there in their coffee shop, the place where their love story had really begun, Alexander thought about all the moments that had led them to this point. The stolen glances, the careful touches, the months of longing and hoping and being afraid to want too much. All of it had been worth it to get to this moment, this perfect, imperfect, absolutely right moment. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced down to see a text from Tyler Peterson asking if he was bringing Thomas to the party they were having next weekend. Alexander showed the message to Thomas, who grinned. Should I tell him we'll be there and we have news? Thomas asked. Alexander looked at the ring on his finger, then at Thomas's face, bright with love and excitement and the promise of everything they were going to build together. Tell him we'll be there, Alexander said, and tell him to get ready for the best news he's ever heard. As Thomas typed out the response, Alexander let himself really absorb what had just happened. 6 months ago, he'd been sitting in this same coffee shop, stealing glances at his best friend and trying to convince himself that friendship was enough, that the ache in his chest every time Thomas smiled at him was something he could live with forever. Now Thomas was his, really and truly his, and they were planning a future together that stretched out ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. You know, Alexander said, watching Thomas's fingers move across his phone screen, I used to think the worst thing that could happen would be losing you, losing our friendship. Thomas looked up from his phone, giving Alexander his full attention. And now I realize the worst thing would have been never knowing what this could be, Alexander said, gesturing between them. Never knowing what it felt like to love you completely and have you love me back the same way. Thomas set his phone aside and leaned closer. We almost missed it, didn't we? Thomas said softly. We almost let fear keep us from this. But we didn't, Alexander pointed out. We were brave when it mattered. We chose each other. We chose each other, Thomas agreed, and the simple words carried the weight of everything they'd overcome to get here. Alexander thought about all the conversations they'd had in this coffee shop over the past year. Thomas talking about his relationship problems, both of them dancing around feelings they couldn't name, the careful way they'd maintained their friendship even as it was evolving into something deeper and more complex. Do you think we'll keep coming here? Alexander asked, looking around the familiar space. Even after we're married and old and boring? Thomas followed his guam, taking in the worn wooden tables, the mismatched chairs, the baristas who knew their orders by heart. Especially then, Thomas said. This is where our story really started, where you first told me you loved me, where I asked you to marry me. Of course we'll keep coming here. Alexander smiled, imagining them decades in the future, gray-haired and wrinkled, still sitting at the same table, still holding hands, still choosing each other every day. The barista who'd served them countless times over the past year approached their table with a smile. Congratulations, she said, nodding toward their joined hands and the ring glinting on Alexander's finger. I've been watching you two dance around each other for months. I'm so glad you finally figured it out. Alexander felt his cheeks warm, but Thomas just grinned. Were we really that obvious? Thomas asked. Honey, the barista said with a laugh, everyone who works here has been taking bets on when you'd finally get together. You two were the worst-kept secret in the neighborhood. She walked away, still chuckling, leaving Alexander and Thomas staring at each other in amazement. Everyone knew, Alexander said, shaking his head. Everyone except us. Not everyone, Thomas corrected. We knew too, on some level. We just weren't ready to admit it yet. Alexander considered this, thinking back to all those moments when he'd caught Thomas looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. All the times their conversations had felt charged with something neither of them was willing to name. You're right, Alexander said finally. I think part of me always knew. I was just too scared to trust it. And now I trust it completely, Alexander said. I trust you, I trust us. I trust that this is real and lasting and worth everything we went through to get here. Thomas brought their joined hands up to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to the ring he'd just placed there. Forever, Thomas said against his skin. That's how long I want this to last. Forever sounds perfect, Alexander replied, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As the afternoon light shifted through the coffee shop windows, painting everything in golden hues, Alexander marveled at how much his life had changed in such a short time. 6 months ago, he'd been a man in love with his best friend, convinced that his feelings were hopeless and one-sided. Now he was engaged to that same man, planning a future together that felt as natural as breathing. They finished their coffee and walked home hand in hand, Alexander's new ring catching the light with every gesture. Neighbors they'd known for years smiled and waved, and Alexander wondered if they could see the change in them, the way their entire world had shifted and settled into something beautiful and right. Back in their apartment, they settled onto the couch where they'd shared their first kiss, where they'd spent countless hours talking and laughing and slowly falling deeper in love with each other. I can't believe this is our life now, Alexander said, curled into Thomas's side, playing with the buttons on his shirt. Better get used to it, Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, because I plan on spending the next 60 years making you this happy. Only 60 years? Alexander teased, looking up at him. You're right, Thomas said, pretending to consider. Better make it 70, just to be safe. Alexander laughed and kissed him, tasting coffee and contentment and the promise of everything they were going to build together. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling, and Alexander felt that familiar flutter in his chest that he now knew he'd never have to hide again. I love you, he said, the words as natural as breathing. I love you too, Thomas replied, and Alexander knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of their story. Outside, the city continued its busy rhythm, people rushing to appointments and meetings and obligations. But inside their small apartment, time seemed to slow down, allowing them to exist in this perfect bubble of happiness and possibility. They had the rest of their lives to figure out the details, to plan their wedding, to navigate the challenges that would inevitably come. But for now, they had this moment, this perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment of being completely and utterly in love. And that was more than enough. That was everything.